Now, if we look at the great religions, in their prophetic tradition, we can see that they all expect a figure who sometime down the corridor of time would usher in an age of peace and justice. That figure even has a name. So for the Hindus, it's the Immaculate Reincarnation of Lord Krishna, or the 10th Avatar. For the Buddhists, it's a 5th Buddha. Now, why 5? It's because 4 in Eastern, if you want, symbology is a magical. It's the number of completion. So the 5th Buddha contains all the perfections. Okay, plus. In the Jewish tradition, it's the Lord of Hosts. In the Christians, the second coming of Christ. In Islam, it's the 12th Imam, okay, or the Qaim. Now, in Islam, they also have a prophecy concerning the 2 blasts of the trumpet. So we have in the Baha'i Faith, first the Bab, who announced his mission in 1844, which, by the way, is the age of Adventism, the millennialists, okay, in both Christianity and Islam, where they calculated from, in Christian terms, from the book of Daniel, they figured 1260 years, etc., from this and that, and they calculated, and they came to 1843 to 1845, which of course is exactly what had happened. I might mention that the first World Congress of Religions in Chicago in 1893, there was a Protestant bishop who made the statement, and not too many people took notice of it. He said, you know, the first time around we missed it. There's a good chance we missed it again. Okay? Because some people were very tuned to what's happening, okay? And they had the actual expectation. The Millerites went up to the Appalachians to wait for the physical descent of Christ on clouds. See, they were taking it literally. Anyway, we have all of these names given to this figure who would usher in the great day of God. Now, every faith, every dispensation, which is the time for Christ's message to rule, okay, in that part of the world, is the day of God. But the great day of God is the fulfillment, the age of fulfillment, the end of the prophetic cycle, and the coming of age of the human race. Now, if you look at prophecies, we've had them. But every time it happened, as we said earlier, we resist it. It's a matter of tradition. We get hung up on names. Okay, so for example, I, as a Christian of the Catholic persuasion, had to go back and say, what do I believe? Because one of the things, two things I learned very well as a Catholic was loyalty and authority. What I had to do is go back up and say, loyalty to whom? And authority from where? Loyalty to Christ, that includes him when he returns. And if this is the second coming, the authority is automatic. It goes with it. Now, we can, you know, the problem with getting into prophecy is you go back and forth on what this means and what that means, and the beast with the 7, this and that, and it never stops, okay, because people have a different meaning. Going back to one of the first statements I made, when we approach a messenger of God, there are certain characteristics of the human being that are necessary. One is, as Baha'u'llah says in a tablet he calls the tablet of the true seeker, he said, we must divest ourselves of all acquired knowledge, of both love and hate, lest love blindly attract us or hate repel us from the truth. See, when you have love and hate, that's a predisposition. That's a type of bias. So what happens to a lot of people is they get hung up, okay, on certain quotes without understanding the full context. And I have great sympathy for people, but if we put our trust in God, if we are sincere, we will be assisted. Jesus said, ask and it shall be given, knock and the door shall be open, okay? But we have to really be submissive and humble before God. Now, when that happens, we can approach the manifestation of God with more logical ways. Okay? For example, one of the things that applies to me, remember we don't have clergy in the Baha'i Faith. Baha'u'llah insisted on independent investigation of truth. But I used to teach world religions, I looked at the figures who were the manifestations of God. And God does something very interesting. First of all, he sends his messengers to the worst part of the world, okay? Whether it's Palestine and the end towards in 30 AD, or whether it's Iran in the middle of the 19th century. These were civilizations which had once known much greater times, but had sunk into fanaticism, superstition, prejudice, etc. That's just a fact, okay, of history. Now that's the first thing he does. And in thinking of that, there's a quote, "The light shineth in darkness." See, if you go into a dark room, the candle is going to stand out. It's going to stand out because by contrast you see the teachings, and that's what happened to the first Babis, the followers of the Bab, and later the followers of Baha'u'llah. They stood out, they were distinguished by their behavior, by their moral character, by their sense of trustworthiness, etc. That's the first thing. Number two, he picks a person who has no social, political, or economic power, whatever. Jesus was a carpenter's son. Now most people are hung up on status, on temporal or social power, okay? Jesus had no social power. He was a carpenter's son, okay? And yet this carpenter's son was able to inaugurate a new civilization which the greatest Roman thinkers couldn't do, even Marcus Aurelius. That's another way. The reason for that, as I understand it, is so that we understand this is God's power that does it against all odds. Muhammad was illiterate, okay? Islam became, in its early years, a pillar, the beacon, the most advanced civilization in the world in terms of mathematics, arts, science, architecture, educational institutions, etc., and that is unquestioned. So when we look at the messenger, we cannot be looking with the eyes of humans in terms of how much money they have, how much social power or political power they have. We have to look at what Baha'u'llah says is his first proof is his own self. His own self means his innate knowledge. Do you remember that Jesus at the age of 12 was talking to the Jewish elders in the temple? Okay, the rabbis, and he was able to say things that where did he get this from? Where was this wisdom from? It was innate. Okay, this is long before he declared his mission. The same thing with the Bab, long before he declared, and Baha'u'llah himself. Neither of them had any formal schooling. Okay, they tried to educate the Bab, and it just didn't work. So they kept him at home. So they have this innate knowledge. The second way of judging is by the teachings. Okay, do these teachings make sense? Now, there are two parts to this. One, they are revolutionary. Remember that when one of the Babis, when Tahireh, a famous Baha'i figure who was a poetess known for her beauty and her purity, used to give talks, and the women used to go to live to her, to listen to her. When she removed her veil, one of the believers cut his throat. He didn't die, okay, but he cut his throat. This was such a horrendous break with tradition, okay. This is a perfect example. It's bound to challenge us, okay. So the teachings, do they make sense? Are they adapted to a far more advanced age? And let me give you an example of this. In the Old Testament, there are 10 death sentences for various crimes, okay? We don't have those death sentences anymore. The Jewish people don't apply those death sentences. Now, there are reasons for that as well, but they're there, okay? We are at a more advanced age, and we are a far more complex society, and the medicine, if you want, and the education that is best for any age is relative to, one, the disease, and two, the capacity of the age to understand and implement those principles. So then you get the writings themselves, and you see the power of the writings, okay? This, I've met many people who just on the writings alone, where does this wisdom come from? Where this revelation, by the way, with Baha'u'llah would just flow, and there would be a number of secretaries furiously copying it down as it came out, and then he would go over it and make sure it was correct and seal it with his ring, okay? So the innate wisdom, the writings, the teachings, okay? And then you get the prophecies. But the prophecies, as we said earlier, are quite frankly designed to make us alert. to make us ready to investigate free of all prejudice and hang-ups. Now, that is a tall order, but it is an order that we are all capable of. We are all capable of doing that. Otherwise, Christianity wouldn't have succeeded, Islam wouldn't have succeeded, Buddha wouldn't have. They've all been successful. But it has been a challenge. Now, last thing. Historically, most of the earlier believers came from the lowest of the society. The 12 apostles were not people of substance, okay? The most educated was a tax collector. Peter, the greatest, used to keep track of the days of the week by counting beans. Some people say loaves of bread. And yet he became a star in the heaven of understanding, as we say, okay? In this age, however, the first believers come from the full range of human experience. Some of them were mullahs, clergy in Islam. Some of them were clergy in Christianity. Okay, George Townsend, who was an Anglican minister, a deacon, Bishop of Clonford, deacon of St. Patrick's in Dublin. I've met a number of clergy who have become Baha'is, nuns, ministers, etc., rabbis. So it is possible for us to put aside our hang-ups and recognize that God's time is God's time. It's not our time. Okay? We don't decide when God chooses to send us another revelation. The last thing I'm going to say is sometimes the teachings themselves give people a challenge. Okay? The teachings themselves, because they require that we at least struggle with those teachings and conform our behavior. If we can do it instantly, fine. But if we have, for example, certain addictions or whatever, then we struggle with it, and with assistance we will get over it. But to refute the writings, to go against the teachings, is a little silly to me. The last thing I'm going to say is that we have the capacity, okay, to change. However, we need to recognize that with all major endeavors involving a transformation of self, we have to rely on assistance. We have to rely on assistance. If we don't rely on assistance, then we're not understanding what humility is. Okay? Because humility really is the recognition that we are powerless without God. Okay? He is the one who created us. And if we are going to become the best that we can become, especially in what Abdu'l-Baha calls the real life, which is the life of the soul, then we need to rely on spiritual assistance. Now, some people come to Baha'i Faith, and this happens, it happens in every age, and that some of the teachings, one or another, are a major challenge to them. They're going to have to change a behavior which they have become used to or addicted to or whatever. Now, some either instantly change or some will struggle to. That's normal. That's human. But to reject the writings is a little silly if we have understood the reality of Baha'u'llah. I'll give you a proverb from the fight game. Don't box with God, your arms are too short. Okay? Now, Baha'u'llah in his writings, okay, promises assistance, and in this tablet of the True Seeker, he lays out the conditions for a purely motivated search for truth. We're all involved with it. We're all capable of it. God bless.